Sorry, one sec. Just make sure that I haven't got anything on here. Right, okay, cool. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 36 of the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. I'm your co-host, Mashal St. Patrick Hewitt. And you know who's with me? It's my partner in crime.
Yeah, Mashal, I was just thinking, it's been about, just under a year and a half since we started the podcast. And that was roughly the last time West Indies won a test series. So ever since then, for most of 2020, it's been a full cuss out of West Indies selection and performances. But that all changes with today's episode because we're coming off a remarkable test series win in Bangladesh, which I'm sure we're still both processing at the moment. But yeah, it's going to be positive vibes, and we've got a special guest with us to join in with that.
100%. As Santoki says, lots of you have been messaging us saying, how comes you haven't done a podcast since West Indies won? And that's how you know that it's such a rare occasion for us to savor that we just wanted to, live in the moment. We didn't want to record anything. We didn't want to do a rum shot diaries. We didn't want to talk to anyone. We just wanted to savor the fact that West Indies had pulled off a test victory in Bangladesh. And without going into it in detail, and we will discuss it with our guest today. For those of you who are listening on audio, obviously, if you're on the visuals, you can already see who our guest is. But it was a momentous victory in Bangladesh, 2-0 series victory. We've jumped on some other podcasts to talk about it, but suffice to say, all we will say for now, before we touch on it during the course of this particular episode, is that as a result of that victory, the Cricket West Indies selectors now have a huge dilemma on their hands as to what happens with test selection going forward. And I welcome that. And I look forward to it. And by the time this drops, we expect the new test squad for the Sri Lanka series to have been announced within the following days. And it will be very, very interesting to see who no longer gets into the West Indies test side. But that's for that, or that's for then. For now, we've got a very, very special guest with us. You must think that Santoki and I actually plan out these podcasts and know who our guests are going to be in advance. But we'll tell you a little secret. After every podcast recording, we don't even know who's next. we just sit down and put our heads together and work out who might be a good person to get on. And we're very, very fortunate to have shared a mutual acquaintance with today's guest. And we have on today probably the most famous person in cricket right now. Channel 4, at the very last second, got the rights for the England-India test series. No one knew up to 48 hours before that test series who was actually going to get the TV rights for it, and Channel 4 got it. And we have today Rishi Persad, the host of Channel 4's return to terrestrial cricket's return, to terrestrial television. Rishi, how are you doing?
I'm very well. I have to say, I'm very excited about being on this podcast. Obviously, as a West Indies cricket fan, when I came across the Caribbean Cricket Pod, it was a real joy to discover other people that suffer the pain, go through the highs and the lows, more lows obviously than the highs, and it was nice to have kindred spirits. So thank you so much for what you do, and also for having me on.
And shout out to Rishi, because he was one of our early followers on Twitter when we first started out. Rishi was there from the beginning, so we knew he was a diehard fan from that moment.
Well, when I first sort of experienced what you guys were doing, I could tell that we were similar in our experiences. The frustrations, I could feel the frustrations and things, that you guys say. The way you say it, only really true people who have suffered the true frustrations of supporting the West Indies for such a long time would have said it in that manner. So I enjoyed that.
I think true West Indies cricket fans, particularly those originating from the Caribbean, ultimately we all want to find some kind of group where we can be counselled. So we can share the pain we've experienced.
I can tell you why Anonymous, West Indies Anonymous. Yeah, we need to support the West Indies. Yeah, I go through the pain.
So Rishi, it's interesting because when obviously this comes out, I'm not certain how many So, like I said, I started off from the top of the show. I started off by saying, no, the host of Channel 4's the host of terrestrial TV's return to England cricket, England versus India. It doesn't get any bigger than that, to be honest. Well, you could argue if it was the Ashes, that's bigger, okay. But right now, in terms of 16 years since cricket's been on terrestrial television, what a gig to land. And before I even get into how you got the gig and so on and so forth, I think I start this way with the kind of link to Santoki saying a fellow West Indian. I think a lot of people who will have turned on their TV, your casual viewers, like, wow, Channel 4's got the Test cricket. This is amazing. And so they'll see your face, and obviously you're there opposite Alistair Cook, Andrew Strauss, etc. How many people do you think would know that you're from Trinidad?
Good question. I don't think a lot of people would know I'm from Trinidad. Immediately, a lot of people think that I'm from Asia, India or Pakistan, or I get a lot of Sri Lankans. I get all sorts of people knowing what my background is. But I hope that over time, my weaving the odd West Indian comment into my conversations suggests that it gives the game away where I'm from. Obviously, a lot of people think that I was also born here in the UK and grew up here, but obviously I was born in Trinidad, grew up there, left there when I was 12 years old to come to the UK. So yeah, I love both countries. I love the UK. I love Trinidad. So I nowadays when people say where you're from, I say I live in the UK, but I'm from Trinidad. And I'm it's the sort of thing that I'm very lucky to have had both experiences. But I don't think too many people look at me and immediately go, that guy's from Trinidad or from the West Indies.
So, and I know Santoki is going to touch on it, but I don't want to jump into that just yet. So the Channel 4 gig, and do you know what, actually, before we get to Channel 4 gig, do you know what, Rishi? Because some of our listeners, maybe a lot for all I know, won't know who you are. And won't know your story. And obviously, you've just touched on the fact that you were born in Trinidad. You came over here when you were 12. We know that you've got a massive, massive love of horse racing, which we'll get into. But if you had to describe yourself to the average punter who has no idea who Rishi Persad is, what would you say?
I'd say I'm one of the luckiest men alive, because I grew up, as you've heard, in Trinidad, loving horse racing and loving cricket. My dad and I spent a lot of time together. He would drag me along. I say drag me along. I used to force myself to force him to take me with him to cricket, racing. So we spent a lot of time together. And when I came to the UK, I didn't have a particular idea of what I was going to do with my life and my career. My dad was a lawyer, and it was kind of assumed that I'd follow that path, but I never really had a passion for it. I wanted to be involved in sport. So I ended up getting into a PR company that worked in sport. At the time, they looked after Vodafone back in the mid-90s. Vodafone sponsored the Derby and they sponsored England cricket. So it was a perfect combination for me. I was able to do both. Then eventually I managed to get a job in broadcasting. So it's very difficult to explain the journey in a short space of time, other than to say that once I got that opportunity in broadcasting back in 2002, it's been a ride that I haven't particularly been ambitious in any different direction, saying I want to do this, I want to do that. I've kind of just gone with it. And that's why I say, when you say, how would you describe it? I would say I'm just a very, very lucky person. There are thousands of people that could do the job I do. They just haven't had the opportunity. They just haven't had the breaks, which is why I will always consider it a privilege to be doing what I'm doing. And I know some people may just say, oh, he's just saying that. But genuinely, when I consider the situations that I end up finding myself in, sitting in the studio with Sir Alistair Cook and Sir Andrew Strauss and Ebony Rainford Brent talking about cricket for a living, it's what I would have dreamt about when I was a child. Apart from batting at 3 and walking out at Queen's Park Oval for the West Indies, the only other thing I was really dreaming about was, maybe a life where I could spend involved in sport, talking about it. And that's what I do for a living. And thankfully, the journey's involved a lot of different experiences in sport, whether it's golf, tennis, Olympics. It's when I look back on it, which I try not to, because the enormity of some of the things that you've been involved or witnessed, you realize just how lucky you are. So it's just one of the when I eventually one day I will look back on it in a whole and just think, growing up watching horse racing in the big yard in Trinidad or Queen's Park Oval cricket, and now I'm doing the job that I'm doing. It's just a boyhood dream being lived out at someone in heading towards their middle age.
I'm glad you've mentioned those varied sports there, because you've been on the Beeb, you've been on ITV, you've been on Channel 4, just to name a few. All obviously household names in the UK. You've covered athletics, the Masters, the Bowls, snooker, the Olympics. But still, I mean, your resume is extensive. I didn't even mention the horse racing there, which I like to say is your number one. Or I'm hope I'm right in saying it's your number one. But how did you get the gig then for the Channel 4? How's it work in your world? Did you put your name forward, or did people reach out to you and say, this is the guy? We've been waiting for 16 years and this is the guy who's got to come on.
Okay, well, genuinely, right, I cannot imagine there'll be anybody out there that would have thought to themselves, right, Channel 4 have had 16 years since they broadcast, or it's been 16 years since terrestrial television has broadcast live Test cricket. Who are we going to get on the day of that return? And I can't imagine anyone said to themselves, yeah, I'll tell you what, Rishy Persad, that's your genuinely, as much as I would like to think that deep down in the depths of Channel 4's HQ, that's how they thought about it, I can't imagine that's how it was. I think a series of circumstances has certainly helped in that. One of the things is the fact that a lot of people that I've worked with in the past on different sports at different organizations, whether it's the BBC or ITV, obviously we're similar age and we move together, we grow up together and we progress together, but people go off in different directions. So people that I've worked with before at the BBC and at ITV have now taken positions at Channel 4, and the production company for the cricket on Channel 4 is Sunset and Vine, and I've worked with Sunset and Vine for, nearly 18, 19 years on different productions on television. And so I know a lot of the people. So when it came to this sort of situation late in the day, and again, I'm second guessing here because I haven't really had a proper conversation with how they came to choosing me, but late in the day, names are scarce of people who may be available. Other people have already committed that they might have wanted. Honestly speaking, I can't imagine that I would have been first on the list of all the people that they wanted. But as things were progressing, they suddenly, I think, realized, well, we haven't got too many options left. This is someone that we've worked with before. We trust him to a degree to get the job done. And he knows something about cricket. He's not the world's expert on cricket, but he can also do a bit of TV presenting. So the combination might just be what we need. And obviously the real expert analysis is going to come from our guests. So it might be a nice combination. And I hope that that's how it's been played out over the first two tests, that I haven't gone in there and gone, yeah, look, I didn't play any form of decent cricket. I just played club cricket and schools cricket. And I'm not gonna tell Sir Alistair Cook, Ebony Rainford Brent, or Andrew Strauss what the field placings would have been had I been captain. But we can talk about it because I'm like you guys. I watch cricket a lot. I watch ridiculously timed cricket abroad. Watching the Super 50 in the West Indies at the moment, and to whatever time it finishes. And you just think, you watch it and you're going, right, he could have done that. What do you reckon? And then I can ask them those questions, and off camera, and they can say, well, maybe not that or area. And they, it's an education for me as well. So yeah, it's just a joy to be in those situations doing what I'm doing.
Well, based on all the feedback that I've been reading, everybody's most very impressed with how you've led the test series so far. I like how you threw in a little sly Super 50 shout there.
I was watching Trinidad doing very well. So,
So I'd like everyone to know that I'm on this episode with a Guyanese and a Trini. But we don't need to talk about Super 50 just yet. And we don't need to talk about Jamaica's struggles in the tournament. But, Santoki, I'm going to hand it over to you, actually.
Yeah, let's get into it. So you talked about how lucky you were growing up in Trinidad and obviously going to the iconic Queen's Park Oval. What are sort of your early memories of games you saw or performances you saw while in Trinidad? And I guess that golden era for West Indies when we were expected to win every single match we played.
Well, often the memories, I always refer to the one that, I was going to the cricket matches from the early 80s. My dad would take me when I was 7, 8 years old. So I'd go to those matches, and I've said this before to other people, but my dad was a member at the Queen's Park Oval. So in the members area, he couldn't take me because I was too young. So there'd be other friends of his that would be in the general crowd. So I'd go with them and I'd sit with them. And obviously they'd be drinking Caribs or whatever and nuts. And the guys in the Oval that would chuck the nuts at people from miles away and you'll throw the money down. And it was brilliant. It was a great experience. And one of the earliest memories that really hit me, though, was when England were touring in, I think it was 86. Pretty certain it was 86. And Greg Thomas was bowling for England. And he was sort of the next fast bowler from England, the next kid on the block who had pace that could rough up the West Indies batsman. And he bowled a short ball to Viv at the Queen's Park Oval. And Viv ducked and his cap fell off. And as you can imagine, the crowd, then it was rammed. Queen's Park Oval in the mid-80s, rammed for an England-West Indies test. And, I could feel the tension and I could feel the crowd, whoa, when Viv had to go and pick up his cap. And Greg Thomas sort of stood there. I remember him staring at Viv, watching Viv's reaction and sort of, so that silent look of, I'm here to give you some trouble, Viv. And Viv picked his cap up and he dusted his cap off. And he walked back he put his cap on, he walked back to his crease. And obviously, the next ball that Greg Thomas was going to bowl, as he was running in, the crowd is now doing that crescendo of noise, for a test match, which you now take for granted at T20s and one days or whatever. You get that sort of, you get an MC G'ing the crowd up. Didn't need an MC to G the crowd up at the Queen's Park Oval in the 80s when the West Indies and England were playing. And Greg Thomas was running to bowl. You could hear the crowd go, whoa. And the next ball he bowled was on a length. And wasn't the best shot that Viv ever hit in his life, but he hit it so hard back past Thomas for 4, and the crowd erupted. And it was just the most wonderful feeling for a Trinidadian supporter, a West Indies supporter, to be part of that. And obviously everybody's jumping around, like, waving flags. You could hear the conch shell being blown. And that sort of memory that I had in the mid-80s is the reason why I love West Indies cricket, why I love cricket, why I love that atmosphere of a test match when it's buzzing, when there's so much at stake, little periods of play where one little change in the passage of play affects the whole outcome of the match, just one tiny thing. And that moment that Viv hit him for 4, Thomas sort of turns, goes back to his mark, and he's waiting, and Viv's still standing in the middle of the wicket, patting the wicket, waiting for Thomas to turn so they could stare each other face to face once again. And Viv let him know, what are you doing? Don't mess with me. But that was a sort of memory that I had, and I went to lots of games at the Queen's Park Oval. I remember, it's so lucky I used to be able to walk to the Queen's Park Oval from where we lived. It would be 10 minutes walking from our house, and then you walk out the ground normally after a West Indies win or a very good day for the West Indies, and the feeling of happiness and joy and the fact that you're sharing this thing with so many other West Indies fans was something that really sort of was one of the highlights of my childhood.
Lovely. Yeah, and I guess I've kind of got an interesting thing to kind of follow on that, because you obviously grew up in Trinidad around the period. So we mentioned earlier about the kind of Indo-Caribbean identity, and me and Michelle, the most popular pod we've had in terms of listens has been the special episode we did on Indo-Caribbean identity and culture in the Caribbean. And I think part of the reason why it was so popular was just because outside of the Caribbean, there was a general unawareness of kind of how prevalent Indian culture is within the Caribbean, especially Trinidad and Guyana, where they form the majority of the populations. And if you look at Trinidad and Guyana, the food, the dal puri, the doubles, the music, the chutney soca, just the general culture, there's a general Indian dominance in the countries. And one thing that came up in the podcast is in 1976, when India came to the West Indies and they secured a win at the Queen's Park Oval, the majority of Trinidadian fans ran onto the pitch and celebrated with the Indian team because they saw themselves as being more connected to India, the motherland, than actual West Indies. And then following on from that, in the 80s, from 1982 to 1994, not one single player of Indian origin was selected to West Indies. So there were accounts saying that for Indo-Caribbean fans during this period, they supported any team playing the West Indies rather than the actual West Indies. Growing up, obviously you were a child at the time. Were you ever aware of this, or did you ever come across any of this?
Yes. Funny enough, I mean, it's great that you bring that up, because I think it's important for our history and our education that people recognize this, that growing up, my dad, for example, supported India. India were his favorite team. He was born in Trinidad. My great-grandfather was the one who was brought over as an indentured labourer. And my dad was obviously the second generation Trinidadian. And so watching him supporting India against the West Indies was always something that I didn't understand. And I couldn't understand, why would you support India when you were born in Trinidad? You grew up in Trinidad. I was born in Trinidad like you, and I grew up in Trinidad. So I support the West Indies. That's the native team to support. And I didn't really understand it as a child, if I'm honest. I didn't quite understand it, and I just thought he was being facetious and trying to wind me up, because we used to have arguments from very young age. We used to have arguments about it. Even to the day that he passed away, we were still arguing about it. And I didn't understand it till I came to school here in the UK, and I started to understand more about the history of West Indies supporters who lived in the UK. West Indies supporters who were born in the UK, yet they supported the West Indies at cricket. And it's the same again with Indian supporters or Pakistani supporters who were born here in the UK but support another team. And I didn't really understand it until I sort of that culture that you grew up with and you miss, and you get, say pulled apart is probably the wrong word, but you're distant from and remains slightly out of reach, but one that you perhaps miss because it's important to you and your family, and it creates that emotion of the motherland that perhaps nobody else who is not in their natural habitat or environment would understand unless they were forced out of it. And it's perhaps that sort of circumstance forcing you out of a situation. So I didn't choose to come to school in the UK. It was my parents who took that decision and brought me here. So because the decision had been forced out of my hand, I longed for something that I still wanted, that something that was taken away from me. And it was that connection that I made with my dad and his family, his father and his grandfather, who obviously felt that they belonged to India, even though they lived in Trinidad. And even though I was living in the UK, my heart belonged to Trinidad. So that's how I began to understand that dichotomy, that dilemma. So I don't have any issues with it. In fact, I respect it because it's honesty, and congruence is very important, I think, for people to be happy. So, I don't, for example, people say, you live here, your life is here. And yes, I love the UK, but when it comes to cricket, I grew up loving Trinidad and I grew up loving the West Indies, and that hasn't changed just because of the place that I live.
And when you sort of mentioned coming to England, I'm assuming at that point you would have had a strong Trini accent. What were people's reaction to seeing like an Indian child with a Caribbean accent? Because I'm guessing they wouldn't associate the two.
Well, I didn't. So I've got to be honest. When I speak to my mum and my brother, true Trini come on, and I talk in like this all the time. When I came to school here, I didn't change my accent at all. I came to school. I went to a prep school in Bury St Edmunds and had only 60 students. And I had to do my common entrance in one term in order to get into the boarding school that I needed to get to in January. So I came over, no idea what I was expecting, freezing cold, as you can imagine, tiny school in the middle of nowhere. And I was speaking like I did my whole life, Trinidadian accent. But the kids that I played football with, for example, they wouldn't understand what I was saying. And I found it a little bit frustrating. When we were on the field of play, like I would say, I'd be shouting, pass it, ball here, pass it. And they wouldn't understand what I'm saying. I would just be ignored. So eventually I started changing my accent a little bit to speak more like them and try to fit in. And in fairness, that's actually, so talking about sort of personalities and well-being and stuff like that. One of the personality traits that I ended up developing almost subconsciously was fitting in, because I was so excluded when I first arrived, being a different looking person, sounding person. And obviously for a child being excluded, any child being excluded from anything, it's a painful feeling. So the counteract to that is to remove those barriers. So I ended up finding myself fitting in and doing things to fit in quite a lot. And it's kind of been a theme of my life. I just, I don't want to be, I know it sounds terrible or slightly perhaps a little bit different for someone who's on television to say, well, actually they don't like being the center of attention. I'm not uncomfortable with it, but I'd rather just sort of fit in and be, so that my style, for example, I think in terms of broadcasting is one that, doesn't want to take the headline. I'm quite happy being part of the team. And that I think is born out of that first arrival in England back in 1986, when I was saying, right, I don't want to be excluded. I just want to fit in. So I'm going to change my accent and stop from talking like this all the time. I'm going to start talking like this. And that's what happened to me in the winter of 86.
Santoki, I'm just going to jump in there.
Yeah.
Rishi, so when you came over, was it just you by yourself or did any family come over?
So my mum and dad brought me over. They drove me to the prep school that I was going to, and then they left. So I was let, obviously, at this prep school, freezing. I mean, I know it was only September, but I was freezing, and I couldn't handle it to begin with. And then, like, the baths were, even though the bath was hot by normal standards now, at the time I felt it was still cold. Everything was really difficult to settle into. But I remember the first half term, my mum and dad came back to check on me during the half term, and my mum brought some bacon saltfish, and I'm salivating now. And she'd cooked it. She'd just landed, and they drove straight from Heathrow Airport to the boarding school to pick me up, to take me for half term week. And in the car, I'd missed the food so much that even though it was cold and it had been cooked 2 days before in Trinidad, or the day before they flew overnight on DWE, and when they landed, I was in the car going from school to the place that we would stay for half term, and I was eating the bacon saltfish at the time because I'd missed it so much. And you see, that's the thing, I missed, because I was so young, I was missing all those Trinidadian West Indian things, which only enhanced my feeling of attachment to the West Indies, which is why when people talk about, when you're supporting, you live in another country, but you support another one. And it's those feelings, I think, that you're sort of reaching out for, the things that you miss.
So you leave boarding school, go uni, then you're into the big wide world. And this is, so Santoki and I were talking about this before, once we knew that you were going to come on, Santoki and I were talking about this, and obviously, so I'm of Jamaican extract and was born in Jamaica. Now, as a Jamaican living in the UK, the Jamaican culture is everywhere. And as much as my parents still live back home and I go and visit them, etc., it's easier in the UK to find Jamaicans, is what I would say. And I've always found it. Now, I could be wrong, and Santoki yourself may well laugh at me and say, wait a minute, you don't know about this and you don't know about that, but I probably don't. I've not met that many Trinis in the whole time that I've lived in the UK. I'm going to be honest with you. And I'll always remember, I think it was the 2009 World Cup, and the T20 World Cup, sorry, I should say. And I think West Indies were playing Sri Lanka at the Oval. I think it was 2009. And I went along with a couple of friends. And I remember that outside the stadium, I heard some Trini accents. I turned round and saw these 6 Trinis with national flags and everything. And I was like, whoa, you lot are in the UK as well. You lot are in the UK as well. And honest to God, I know that sounds ridiculous, but honest to God, I feel like that was the first time in my life I'd properly met UK London Trinis. And I'm just, I should just say UK Trinis, never mind London, but just in, I guess what I'm getting at is, how how did you find it once you're in the big wide world and connecting with other Trinidadians in the UK?
I agree with you. I think it's been hard sort of touching base with a great deal of other Trinis. It's funny because once I first started appearing on television, a few of them reached out to me. This is, sort of 18 years ago. A few of them reached out that I would have perhaps met once or twice. So in the first few years of working in television, I contacted or was in contact with a few Trinis. I remember there was a kid that I went to school with in Trinidad, his mum was Scottish and his dad was Trinidadian, and his mum actually taught me at school in Trinidad. And then when she retired, the whole family came back to live in the UK. And when I got on television, he reached out. And he contacted me, and so we became friends again from school back when I was at a grade school in Trinidad. And there was one other guy who is a doctor over here, and he reached out. So I remember sort of connecting with those people again. But as you move through, doing the things that I've done, I haven't really bumped into a great deal of them. But you do, like you said, you do listen out. And occasionally, I'm not watching television and I hear an accent. There was a woman cooking on a program the other day, and I could hear her speaking, and she sounded. So as soon as you hear the sound, the next thing you do is, what's the name? What's the name? Is it a name that I recognise? And then you obviously the Google now works. It's brilliant. And then you're like, oh yeah, she is Trini. So it's you do. I have identified a few more. But not as many. But then you think of, I think to myself, there's obviously Sir Trevor McDonald, who's a Trinian, and you bump into other people who are from Trinidad and have crossed paths in the career that I've managed to do. And actually, then I go back to Trinidad occasionally, and people then put me in touch with relatives that they have over here. You know how it is. So
yeah.
You take this back as well for them and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. Okay, no problems.
Santoki, I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, I guess so one thing we said at the top of the show was, I guess people would associate you with horse racing, and I guess a lot of people might think that you picked up your love of horse racing in England, but as you mentioned, it started in Trinidad. And I guess horse racing culture has a long and rich history in the Caribbean, which, I mean, a lot of people outside of the Caribbean wouldn't know, but it makes sense when you think about the colonial link, similar to cricket. That's why it's kind of stayed there. Kind of your experience of horse racing. I think Trinidad has one race course at the moment, the Santa Rosa Park. What is the horse racing culture like, particularly in Trinidad?
Well, unfortunately, the horse racing culture now in Trinidad is not as strong as it used to be when I was growing up in the late 70s, early 80s. It was very, very strong. They had 3 race courses in those days. There was the Union Park race course near San Fernando. There's obviously Santa Rosa in Arima, which still exists now, and that's a centralized race course. But the big yard, as they called it in Port of Spain at the Savannah, that was, I mean, people often, you get these questions. People say to you, your favorite racing memory and stuff like that, which you get in magazines or questions or whatever. And I sometimes I don't bother saying because some people don't know about it. But for me, speaking to guys who would understand it in the West Indies, growing up in Port of Spain with the racecourse at the Queen's Park Savannah, which is obviously that massive park, big roundabout, massive park in the middle of it. That was just the most wonderful childhood memories that I had, because it was also racing and cricket are quite interlinked in Trinidad. A lot of people that were involved in racing love their cricket, and so it kind of worked together. A lot of the people that you'd see at cricket matches would be at the racing, and the importation of horses from the UK, from America was strong, especially the UK back in those days, and it was top class for the Caribbean. It was one, that and cricket were the 2 top sports, and racing in Trinidad, I think, was probably in the 80s very strong, probably stronger than Barbados and Jamaica. But I think as time's gone on, Barbados and Jamaica have strengthened, and Trinidad's lost its strength. But the massive crowds that used to be there for a race day, well, it would be bigger than the cricket matches. Obviously, it had more room, but it was just the popularity in the nation with racing was enormous. And so Christmas time, like now, people talk about what's your favorite Christmas memory, and I say, what, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day we used to spend looking at the race cards for Boxing Day. You know, my mum and dad would have friends come around to our house, and we'd be sitting there on Christmas Day having our lunch, you know, and then afterwards we'd all sit together talking about the races for tomorrow and what you're all betting on and what horses you think might win. And it was just fantastic. And the children used to be fascinated by it. So one of the things I'm quite passionate about is adults including children in their discussions about sport, because I think that's the best way to get kids involved in it, is by you talking to them about it, with the adults talking to them, engaging them about it. Because when I was a child, the fact that my parents, and my dad in particular, used to ask me about racing and about cricket, it felt like he valued my opinion and what I was saying. And we would talk as, you know, as a group of people, all different ages, about what might be happening about cricket. And whether or not I was talking absolute garbage or not, they didn't entirely dismiss me. And we would talk about it, and I felt totally engaged in it. And because of that, it then made me want to watch the racing, watch the cricket, go along, share in the experiences, which is why, you know, I love it now.
I think it's interesting. Like, you give us that history, certainly in Trinidad, and off air before we started this pod, I was saying to you about how when I was living in Jamaica, turning on TV on a Saturday, the racing from Caymanas Park it's like a ritual in Jamaica, and it's massive in terms of the contest of Caymanas Park. And we haven't even touched it, but I think Santoki kind of hinted at it in so much as a lot of these racetracks, certainly Caymanas, are built on old slave plantations, fields, etc. But what's quite interesting to me is that, so horse racing and cricket obviously exist in the Caribbean. Then you come over to the UK. Neither one of those two sports are very diverse. So I don't know how listeners will feel about me going down this route, but it's true. Cricket is more diverse than horse racing, but certainly when I think horse racing, Rishi, I think horse racing in the UK, you must be one of what? Maybe six people of colour. And I'm exaggerating, but seriously, when I turn on the TV, it doesn't look very diverse to me.
Yeah, well, that's so I was pilloried for saying something along those lines. Last year, I did an interview with a friend of mine, a guy called Josh Apiafi, who works on Sky Sports Racing, and we talked about it. And he's obviously pro diversity and inclusion, and I'm on the diversity in racing steering group. And it means a lot to me to try and expand the appeal of the sport. And when I mentioned it, as you can imagine, the social media reaction was like absolute garbage. There's no problem with the sport, you know, it's all fine. But in fairness, the authorities did look at what I'd said, and they asked me to make a presentation to the board for the British Horse Racing Authority, and they backed my comments. And they backed the statement saying that they'd like to be more diverse and more inclusive. So they recognise it, which I think is obviously the first step to recognising your failings before you can improve on it. But you're right. It's funny because I've never had, you know, a significant. I've encountered a few incidents where I've been on the receiving end of racist comments or racist tones, but it's not been to the extent that it should prevent me from being part of the sport. And in general, and I said this at the time, I said, in general, I think racing is a welcoming sport. But the image that you point out in the question that you're at is exactly the perception that I think people have. And we need to step away, look at what do people think about it? Oh, okay. Well, it's not actually like that. It's not as bad as, you know, it's not a place for people of a diverse ethnic minority background. What it is, it just has that perception. So we need to destroy that perception and construct a new one. And that, unfortunately, takes a lot of time. And I think that's the thing that puts a lot of people off going down that route, that they want a quick, instant fix. And I'm afraid that in my deliberations and discussing it with a lot of other people, there's nothing that's going to happen overnight. But the first step is the most important one, which is recognize the failings. And then the next step is change the perception. But that I think will take a bit of time.
And I guess people listening in going, wait a minute, these guys talk about horse racing. What's going on? Listen, we might be called the Caribbean Cricket Podcast, but we go down any route we want. But I am going to segue that back to cricket because, and Santokyo, maybe you want to carry on after I say this, but you arrive over to the UK, like we say earlier on, boarding school, etc., etc. Now, one thing that Santoki and I have been very vocal in talking about is, and the three of us, okay, you're Trini born, I'm Jamaican born, etc. But essentially, we've all grown up in the UK. Yeah. Now, the UK fan base, and by UK fan base, I mean the diaspora. So the diaspora market in the UK for West Indies cricket, to me, has shrunk massively. I came over here in 84 with my family. And I'm going to say all the way up until the mid-90s, going to see the West Indies play in England was still a huge cultural event, probably because we weren't losing. And it was still like the Oval even up to the mid-90s would be packed with West Indians there to see the team not lose. In the last 20 years, so let's go 2000 onwards, I think the number of people who would identify as West Indian cricket fans who are part of the diaspora, unless it's like a massive World Cup and we're on the verge of winning something, I don't think many people identify really with the cricket anymore. And Santoki and I always joke and say that our podcast, one of the reasons we set up the podcast was to try and tap back into that market. But Santoki and I always say that we're a dying breed of the generation underneath the generations who came before us aren't into cricket. Santoki, do you want to add anything there? I might have waffled a bit there.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there's definitely been a dramatic decline in fandom, and that's partly due to the performances of the West Indies side, and also I guess the generation that came from the Caribbean. I don't know, there just seemed to be a missing link in terms of passing that on to the next generation who were born in England. And obviously there's more of a liking towards football. So it's interesting that there has been a sort of shift in dynamics when you think about traditionally how popular cricket was in the West Indies. I mean, Rishi, how you describe the Queen's Park Oval in the early 80s compared to the diaspora in England where there's only a handful of fans. I guess what we're trying to ask is kind of what are your views on why cricket sort of hasn't translated to the West Indian diaspora?
Well, something that you said a moment ago about, when you came over in 84, Mash, about the feeling of being a West Indies cricket fan. The team were doing well, and there was an automatic respect for West Indies, I felt. So I'll go back to the first year I went to boarding school. So I'd done my term at prep school, and I went to boarding school. Now remember, I'm a term late. Everybody else is a term ahead of me. All the relationships have been made. All the friendships are going ahead. So I was a bit, again, excluded for the first term. By the end of that first term, it was getting to the point where we were going to have cricket nets. And by this point, people knew where I was from. So as we got to the cricket nets, suddenly people were interested in talking to me. Not because they knew anything about me as a person, other than I was from the West Indies. And immediately it gave me respect in their eyes that this guy's from the West Indies. Well, the West Indies are brilliant at cricket. They're the best team in the world at cricket. He's going to be all right, isn't he? If he's from the West Indies, he's probably going to be able to bat like Viv Richards and bowl like Malcolm Martin. nowhere near either one of those. I was going to, yeah, embarrassing. But because of that, automatically it gave me an opportunity to feel a bit better about my heritage, my roots, the fact that I was from Trinidad. And suddenly people were chatting to me, and I became part of the society at school, part of that little thing. And I think that has certainly dissipated. The idea of being from the West Indies and the West Indies being a thriving cricketing nation now. And the hardest part about being a West Indies fan now, I think, is when people pity us.
Yeah.
People pity West Indies cricket fans and say, it's good for cricket if West Indies do well.
Yep.
I know what people mean, and I know it's good intention, but as somebody who watched West Indies destroying other teams year upon year, growing up, I used to say things, they'll never lose a test series in my lifetime, and all that sort of garbage. it's sad watching the way that's happened. So I feel I genuinely feel that the biggest damage done to the reason why we have the diaspora that we do now is because of the success of the team. And it's so fragmented at times. I mean, you guys, you've talked about it so many times. People don't know what's happening with the team from one week to the next. So it has been that way. Hopefully it's getting a bit better. Under the previous management incumbent, players would be selected, tours would be cancelled because there were dispute. I mean, all that sort of stuff. I mean, how can fans be expected to participate in sharing those experiences with the team when the team don't even know whether they're going to be playing for the West Indies? The guys don't even know they're going to be playing for the team. It's been a very, very difficult ride, and I think that alienates the fans and alienates the people or the association of the respect that comes with being West Indies fans.
Yeah, most definitely. And I mean, there's possibly other factors on top of that, such as I've always said that the cost of going to cricket in the UK prohibits. I think I'm not saying, I don't know if it's a major role, but I certainly think it prohibits people wanting to go. If you support a team that doesn't win, and then you're trying to price me out of the game as well, I'm not making any effort to turn up, no matter where I'm from and who they may be. But like we said it at the top. And it's almost like a nice roundabout segue. That's why the win in Bangladesh was so affirming for West Indian fans. It came completely against the odds with a team that was given zero chance of winning in those conditions, and both wins were miraculous wins at the same time. And whilst it doesn't evoke the West Indies of old in the sense of course, we didn't have to do miraculous wins, we just blasted teams away, it evoked the same sense of pride that you would have to say, wow, this is the West Indies, this is the team that I support, this is what they can do. But again, I totally echo what you're saying there, Rishi. I think straight after the win, I went on Twitter and said, please can people now don't respond with the West Indies have turned a corner. Don't say, oh, this is brilliant, it's great now for world cricket to see us. No, we don't want to hear any of that. We don't want to hear any of that. Let us just savor the win. and that's enough. And that's enough for now. But we had quite a lot of questions that came in for you, Rishi, with regards to what you're doing at Channel 4. Bear with me, because undoubtedly I should have had these ready, but then that would assume that I'm organised.
Well, while you're searching the question, I just pick up on what you're saying about West Indies winning. See, that's another thing. The fact that people every time, because of our history, and I think the history has weighed on us like the sword of Damocles hanging over our head. The fact that every time we produce a really good performance. You remember the time we bowled England out for 50 in Jamaica? Jerome Taylor was. People were saying, well, look at their bowling lineup. They've got a strong bowling lineup, good batsmen. The corner could be turned here. And every time there's a glimmer of hope, whether it's the T20 success, whether it's the second T20 World Cup, whether it's winning the first test of the last series against England here, people reach for it. I think they're so desperate for the West Indies to reclaim some of those glory years. Those glory years are never coming back.
Yeah. I'm so glad to hear you say that.
It's hard to say it. It hurts my feelings to say it because I love those glory years. I mean, we all did, but it's not coming back. And what I would like to see is people just almost forget the glory years and just go, right, this is the West Indies now. Let's not worry about what's gone on in the past and what they're going to build up to. They're building up to something completely different now. And I would like to see the progress of the team judged solely on what their achievements are in the here and the now.
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree with that. So one of the quick questions, I'm just going to pick out some of the key ones that we got. So the last test you did on TV, this one's for the England and India fans. We might clip this one because this will be clickbait. But no, the last test that you did on TV, obviously the second test between England and India, a huge debate was raging. I don't even know if it's still raging now. But the question we had come in, and this is from Knuckle, says, what did Rishi make of the pitch discourse and the often coded way that spinning pitches are perceived against seaming pitches? Now, obviously, you said at the beginning, well, obviously, you're not going to tell Alistair Cook or Ebony Rainford Bren or Andrew Strauss what you're well actually this is what I think the answer is. But what did you make of the whole discourse that went on during and after that test?
I all the way through the test, the discussion of the pitch, I was happy just to throw it out to the experts, get their opinion. My own thought is, it's a test match in India. The pitch is going to turn. It's going to turn a lot. If England had won the toss and batted first, the question I had would, what would happen? What would have happened in that test? Well, I still think India would have won. Personally, I think India put up a better performance. You have to remember that's now 3 innings in a row that England haven't got more than 180. So there's clear, and obviously the pitch was turning a fair amount at the end of the first test. So that's obviously 3 innings now where their ability to bat against spin has been put under the microscope, and they've come up short. And in fairness to Joe Root, after the second test, he was quite happy to admit that that's a massive challenge for them, and use the phrase "honest discussions," which I'm not entirely certain it's the most apt phrase, but it's a window into the fact that they're not playing spin well enough. I don't think that, whether it's, I know people say, well, you go to different countries and you've experienced different conditions. Yes, I think that's the beauty of Test cricket or all cricket. You have to experience different. The whole thing I thought about traveling and going on tours, etc., is to experience different cultures, different ways of life, different pitches. It's all part of the tapestry of what is involved in touring. And I don't think, in all honesty, I don't think England have a problem with that. I think England are just like, okay, well, how are we going to combat this for the next 2 tests? So I don't have a problem at all with the pitch that was prepared for this test match. I remember in in the West Indies against Australia, way back in the early 90s, when I think the West Indies might have lost the first test and they came back and won the second test, but they prepared green wickets in order to give the West Indies bowlers an opportunity. It was obviously going to be dangerous for the West Indies as well, because Australia had a good seam attack. So it was, but you do that. You prepare those kind of wickets to suit your team, to give you a chance of winning. So I don't see any issues with the pitch being the way it was in India. I mean, if you go to India and not find a spinning pitch, then you got on the wrong plane.
Well, I'm glad.
How do you see the rest of the series going on at the moment? We're 1-1, England, India. At that stage, how do you see the rest of the series panning out? 2 tests left.
Well, without wanting to sound too optimistic, I think England have a very good chance, I think, in the next test, because it's a day-nighter. Obviously, there's been one previous test match that's been a day-nighter in India. That was India-Bangladesh, and that was in Kolkata. Funny enough, I know it's 2 different grounds, but that if my research is correct, I don't think 1 wicket fell to spin in that match. So I'm not saying that that's what's going to play out here, but at least suggests that playing a day-night game with the pink ball in India might offer a little bit more for the English seamers. India have very good seamers as well. Don't forget, Bumrah is going to come back in, having been rested for that test. Sharma's been very, very good. But I just think that England's, whether they, obviously Jimmy Anderson probably come back into the side. Archer could potentially play again. England's seam attack is strong. And there were times in the first test where they were pretty threatening, So I would think England would be more confident going into this test match in the day-night scenario than had it been another day match coming up, normal times.
So in that sense, then you're saying that you think the series might end 2-2.
I reckon that. Well, assuming so the colour of the pitch again is another issue. So. The first test in Chennai, the first test was played on red soil. The second test played on black soil. And Alex Stewart was saying that he understands the same 2 could potentially, or the same 2 options could potentially be in use. So whether they use the red soil pitch first for the day-nighter and the black soil, I'm not certain yet. I'll have to check on that before the test match starts. But I think that's another important factor when deciding. If it is similar to what they had in Chennai, then yes, I think it could potentially be 2-2, which would be very exciting, of course.
Yeah, indeed. This next question turns out to be about 6 questions in one. So I'm going to try and break it down the best way I can. And I don't actually know how much info you can give us, but we'll go with this. So the first one is, how much time did Channel 4 Cricket get to prepare before the first test? And how much insight would you have had in terms of like the set and how it looked? Let's go with it that way first and foremost.
Okay, so the first I heard about it was 10 days before the first test. And we were told that nothing was going to be confirmed for another day or so. And then that dragged on into the week of the test match. So the first test started on the Friday. It was not until lunchtime on the Wednesday that it was all done and dusted, by which time, obviously, it's very late. So Channel 4 had made some tentative steps to prepare should the contract be awarded to Channel 4. But obviously, it's quite expensive to do all these things for no reason. So it was only tentative steps. So in fairness, Channel 4 found out less than 48 hours before the first test that this was definitely happening. So in terms of preparing the set and things like that, they'd only really had the 48 to 72 hours really to get that done and dusted. And I didn't see the set till the morning of the first test match. I had photos sent to me of this because obviously footfall is important not to have too much of it unnecessarily. So I was kept abreast of it. People sent me photos and this is where it's going to be. And we'd spoken about it and everything. And so, but I knew what it looked like, but I didn't know what it would feel. I hadn't sat in it till that first morning of the test match, having sat up in the chair in the studio.
So the India England series did coincide with the Bangladesh West Indies series, and so Santoki slept through most of that series because he would wake up for like the post tea session, whereas I was dragging myself awake at 3:30 in the morning to watch session 1 and 2. So when you're presented on TV like that, how do you catch your sleep for those test matches, or do you just go to bed at 7 o'clock at night? Like how are you doing it?
Yeah, so the routine has been get up at 1 o'clock, get in just after 2 to the studio. Obviously, you go on air at 3:45, and you come off air at just after midday or just before midday, and then there's a little chat afterwards. Make sure everything's all right. Is there anything that you want to do better for the next day? Always worth having those conversations. And then I come home, and when I come home, the first couple of days it was hard to stay awake. But my daughter is 10, so she keeps me awake. But then I got into the routine of right, okay, so we'll eat at about 5:30, and then at about 7 o'clock I go upstairs and I try and sleep. And generally, once the test match was up and running, apart from the very first night when I went to bed nervous and excited, and that whole sort of when you're going into bat, that feeling of not being sure and you're getting butterflies in your stomach. Apart from the first night, it got better. So I'd go to bed at about 7 or lay in bed, and generally I fell asleep pretty quickly. But obviously now, having had the first 2 tests and got into that routine, now I can't sleep at 1:30 in the morning. My body clock is getting me up at 1:30, getting ready to go to work, but there's nothing to go to, so I have to try and go back to sleep.
This wasn't raised in the question, but based on what you said, it's kind of made me think about it. So obviously, and we said it at the top, you've covered so many sports and so many different networks, etc. Is cricket something that you'd like to branch out into more? So I'm about to do a sales pitch for you. So BT Sport, if you're listening, given Cricket West Indies have just signed their deal with BT Sport for the next 5 years coverage of home series, BT Sport are going to need something similar, surely. So I guess what I'm saying to you is, should other opportunities come up to front cricket, is that something you'd be interested in as well?
Well, I'll let you into a secret here. So when I joined racing, or the first racing channel I joined at the races back in 2002, after about 6 months, Channel 4 came along. They knocked on the door and they said, right, we'd like you to work on Channel 4 Racing. So I said, well, great, fantastic. So I joined Channel 4 Racing, and after doing a couple of shows for Channel 4 Racing, the B came and they said, we'd like you to come and work on BBC. So there was, for a brief moment, a bit of a battle between the BBC and Channel 4. And Channel 4 said, well, we've got cricket at the time. We can do some cricket work. And the BBC said, hang on a second, we have our eyes on doing more cricket in the future, or we have certain events that we'd like to bring onto our portfolio. So you can work on those. So there was that debate for a time. And when I joined the B, I managed to do work on the Ashes tour of 06, 07, World Cup in the West Indies in 07, 2011 World Cup, and the 2009 T20 as well. So I did a few cricket gigs along the way, not as many as I'd like to have done. But yes, cricket and racing were the two things that I felt most comfortable talking about, chatting to other people about, watching. Those were the two sports that I grew up with more than anything else. I play golf, I love golf. But the two that were my childhood sports were racing and cricket, and the ones that I feel pretty at ease at. So yes, I mean, I'd love to do more cricket, but like I said, very early on, I think I'm very lucky to be doing what I'm doing. So I'd rather go keep that style of of being grateful for what we have, as opposed to sort of chasing anything too much.
Now we'll chase for you. BT Sport, if you're listening, bring us all in. Bring in Rishi and bring us in with you.
What a lineup! What a lineup! I mean, when it comes to West Indies cricket, you couldn't come with a stronger lineup than you two.
You know what, Santoki? Let's go to the. I'm going to let you do the questions.
You know what, Mash? Before we get to the final wrap-up questions, I guess as a level-headed West Indian fan, I'd like to ask Rishi the following question. So, December the 16th could go down in hindsight as a monumental day in West Indian cricket history. As Michelle penned an article for the Cricketer magazine saying, "Is it time for Jason Holder to hang up the reins as captain of the West Indies side?" At the time, people were getting at him saying, "This is ridiculous. Jason Holder's an upstanding captain."
Yeah, say it as it is. I was getting cussed out right now.
Michelle was getting cussed out. He was ready to delete his social media accounts. He wasn't sleeping at night. It was getting to him. Obviously, in the wake of Bangladesh winning under standing captain Craig Brathwaite, now we've seen Sir Clive Lloyd, sort of the godfather of West Indies cricket, saying, "Hold on, maybe it's time for Jason Holder to step aside and have a change." What are kind of your thoughts on Jason Holder's captaincy at the moment? Do you think it's time? Do you think he's had long enough time now in the position, and it's time to sort of? I mean, his quality is enough to stay in the team. He's a world-class all-rounder. But in terms of captaincy, do you think he's run his course?
When I saw the article and the tweet at the time, I wanted to send my support, but the backlash you're getting, like, just burn on your own. So sorry. Yeah, I'm with you. I love Jason Holder as a cricketer. I think he is a tremendous cricketer, all-round cricketer. 100% wants him in the West Indies side. But I think we need a different direction with a captain. I think Craig Brathwaite did obviously brilliantly in Bangladesh. He seemed to have the troops rallied in his direction. I mean, I've been saying for a long time that I wanted Kieran Pollard back in the Test team and being captain.
So wait 1 minute. 1 minute. Toki, when I said this, you said you didn't know me anymore.
So my brother is also like a massive West Indies fan, and we both. I promise you, when he took over in charge of the white ball cricket, we both texted each other at the same time one morning to say best captain West Indies have had in a long time. It's a thing that the thing that he does is he strikes the right balance of fear and respect, I think, in the way he goes about doing his job. Yeah. Because of his standing in white ball cricket around the world, he has that automatic reverence. People respect what he's doing. It's that word respect again. And I'm not saying people don't respect Jason Holder, but Jason Holder hasn't achieved the success that goes with the respect, all around the world, or indeed just with the job that he's doing in Test match cricket for the West Indies. So I think what we need is a character who's going to jump in there and have that straight away. He's going to have that respect. And I think Pollard is one of those characters. Brathwaite's another option because he's one of the rare things in an opener that's probably going to get picked. Yeah. For the West Indies. I mean, who else is there really who's guaranteed to get picked as an opener? But also, I like the fact that in the hardest situation, whether, as you guys mentioned it, against the odds, he stepped forward and got the team going. I think they were inspired. I think Clive Lloyd wrote to the team before the series, didn't he? Right, and it said this is an opportunity to do something really important for the West Indies. Everyone thinks that you're going to get beaten here, but this is an opportunity to show people what you're made of, your character. And I think Pollard's the type of leader that inspires that. You watch the way he conducts himself, in the Super 50, or whether he's captaining whatever team he is in world cricket, and he definitely gets people playing for him. I'm not saying Jason Holder hasn't done that, but is he doing it often enough? Has he done it often enough? I don't see the evidence that he has, because the results are pretty poor from the last few incumbents that have been captain of the West Indies.
Well, if people come into your mentions, that's on you. Richie, listen, you've been an amazing guest, as we knew you would be. But Santoki, I'm going to switch it up today. I'm going to let you do all the final questions.
Yeah. Okay, Rishi. So I guess the first, we've got a few quick fire questions we ask all our guests. I guess the first one is, who is your favorite all-time West Indian player?
Quick fire, it'd be Lara. But can I give a mention to Carl Hooper?
Oh yes. Oh. Any time of the day.
I always used to say that Brian Lara is my favourite cricketer, obviously from Trinidad. But if I watched a Lara 100 and a Hooper 100, I think I might enjoy the Hooper 100 slightly more.
Yeah, well,
that's that he used to hit off fast bowlers, where he used to punch it like that down the ground. Just magic.
And your favourite all-time innings from a West Indian player? Can be across any format.
Well, I'll go back to Lara and the 153 not out against Australia in '99.
Yeah.
You want to pretend to be one of these cricketers when you're growing up as a child, and if you could imagine the situation, West Indies been bowled out for next to nothing in the first test. The people, the officials, the people saying Lara's got to go as captain. Then he makes that double 100 in the second test in Jamaica, where obviously he'd taken the captaincy from Courtney Walsh and people hated him. And then he comes to 1-1. They go to Barbados. Things are against them. What were they? Nothing for 5. And he's there marshalling the tail. And look at the attack as well. McGrath, Gillespie, Warne, and McGill, a pretty strong Australian attack. And to produce that sort of innings, and then there's the byplay when he was hitting the helmet, and then by McGrath, and then he walked up to him and they shoulder to shoulder, and then he pulled the next ball for 4. One of my favourite innings of all time.
Yeah, anyone who's never actually watched that innings, even if you just go and watch the highlights of it, and that innings also evokes what you were saying at the top about when a West Indian crowd, that was Test cricket, that wasn't T20, that wasn't a one-day match. The crowd, it was like they were all at a dance hall. They were at a bashment or a serious line. The crowd was hyped beyond belief.
You don't need an MC going, right, everybody, this is put some music on. None of that. It's just the cricket getting people into that frenzy.
And all right, the final question, I guess, we're going to try and avoid Trini bias. So you can't say Queen's Park Oval. But I guess, firstly, where, in your opinion, is the best place other than the Queen's Park Oval to watch cricket in the Caribbean?
Oh, in the Caribbean. Good question. I have to say I miss it, because I managed to watch a couple of games there a few years ago when it was still going, but the Antigua Recreation Ground.
Oh, interesting. Any particular reason why?
It was bang in the middle of, obviously, of St. John's. And it really felt like you were in and around everything that was going on. I remember watching a game there, what was it, God, it would be 15, 16 years ago now, even more than that. And just the atmosphere, and also watching Test cricket with the sound, Chicky sound system, people, the guy hanging off the railings with all his pads on and everything. And when he was imitating, what was the guy playing his shots? He was, whatever was happening on the field, he was doing an instant.
Oh yeah.
Gravy. It was just brilliant. And it's that gets me more than anything else. The atmosphere at cricket grounds. Yes, I've been to the SCG, which I think is an amazing cricket ground. I've been to the MCG, which is fantastic. And I've been to grounds in India as well, which are all brilliant experiences. but it's the atmosphere in the ground that wins me over more than anything else, and the way that the fans respond to it, which is why, you know, when you ask straight away, it's the thoughts of what did you enjoy the most? It wasn't just the setting, it was the enjoyment of the experience with the people.
All right, I guess as Michelle said, Rishi, you've been an amazing guest. A word of advice: you might want to block your social media accounts after both saying that India won't win the series against England and Jason Holder should be removed as captain. But no, other than that, really insightful conversation. Talked about a variety of things, and I think I speak for Michelle as well when we said we've thoroughly enjoyed this whole conversation, Rishi.
I've enjoyed every moment of it as well. Like I said, it's a real pleasure for me to share this chat with two people who I think have the same feelings about West Indies cricket. As you say, you know, that's a rare thing nowadays to find those, especially here in the UK.
Most definitely. So, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, what else can I say? I can't add anything further to that. Suffice to say, though, if you've stuck with this pod the whole way through, do not be fooled that Rishi and Santoki are friends, because the Super 50 final is likely to be between Trinidad and Guyana. So if it pans out like that, their friendship ends and the cussing begins. So look out for that. Look out for that on social media in the following week when we get to the Super 50 final. But as Santoki says, Rishi Persad, everyone, what an amazing guest. Obviously, he'll be fronting the third test and the fourth test on Channel 4. Stay locked in for that. We'll be with you soon with episode 37, looking ahead to the West Indies Sri Lanka series. But that has been episode 36, people. We've been the Caribbean Cricket Podcast. Thank you and good night.